Hello, friends. David Turner here with my friend and former colleague Wendy Widder to talk about her Daniel volume in the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary on the Old Testament series. So, as many of you know, many of you don't. So I'll just briefly give a bit of a vita for Wendy. She's a graduate of Cedarville University, of Grand Rapids Theological Seminary, lately lamented by those of us associated with it. She studied at the University of Wisconsin and received her PhD from the Free University of South Africa under the leadership of Cynthia Miller. So we're really great to have Wendy here with us today. Hi, Wendy.
Hey, good to see you.
Yeah. So we messed up in not alluding to previous commentary Wendy wrote on Daniel in the Story of God series for Zondervan. And so I guess I'd just like to start by asking Wendy to tell us briefly about those two series and how her previous commentary in the Story of God series and the commentary here in the Zondervan Exegetical series are different and how they're similar. So let us know, please.
Yeah, so the Story of God series, if you're familiar with it, looks like this.
Nice.
I sometimes explain it to people who are familiar with commentaries as a new version or a revised version of the NIVAC series. So it's really intended to be a friendlier sort of read. If you're not excessively familiar with the languages, it also has the section on how to preach this. I think the NIVAC calls it bridging the context or something. This series works off the story. So how to listen to the story, how to understand the story, how to tell the story. So it's a very manageable kind of commentary, very readable. I've recommended it to people who don't have any particular theological education, as being fairly readable. The exegetical series, ZECOT, which looks like this. Well, first, it's twice as long. So there's first difference. So trying to write a second commentary on the same book without plagiarizing yourself is kind of a fun little game. I hope I did it. I think I did it. But it's much more concerned with taking the language, the original language, seriously, and the way the authors and speakers shaped the telling of their story. So they call it discourse analysis, but how we speak and how we write with intention. So for example, if you're talking to somebody and you might think they've sort of stopped listening to you, you might say, and so, or listen up, or hey, you'll use some sort of cue to get their attention. Sometimes if you're talking to somebody and you use their name when you don't need to, because you obviously know who they are, David, but I just, for no reason at all, David might just keep saying your name, and there would be some rhetorical purpose to that. And it would vary on the context. So in the exegetical commentary series, that was really the intent, was to take a fresh look at the texts and really consider the flow of the argument, how it's broken up, what sort of devices the author uses. And for me, in Daniel, one of the best examples of this is Daniel 4, which is Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, where he dreams about this great tree that's chopped down, and Daniel interprets it for him. And the oddest thing about this chapter is that it is almost all in the first person voice of Nebuchadnezzar. And that's just really odd and unusual. And I might even say weird. Why is the biblical text allotting this whole chapter, and it's a long chapter, to the first person voice of a Gentile king, and the Gentile king who destroyed Jerusalem and took them captive? And so thinking through why that was the choice for how this story is told, what's the significance of that? That's something that would come out in this kind of commentary that probably doesn't come out in the Story of God.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to leave you hanging on why Daniel 4 is like that.
That's why
It's a
people got,
fantastic, I think it's fantastic. It's just a great chapter, why they let Nebuchadnezzar tell the story.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's why people got to buy the book, right?
That's
To
right.
find the
That's
answer
right.
to that question. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I noticed that, as one might guess from a series called Story of God, that there's a lot of emphasis on intertextuality and what text might have been on Daniel's mind from
Right.
previous Old Testament revelation when he was writing. I think he what specifically refers to Jeremiah in
Mhm.
beginning of chapter 9, if I recall. Been a long time since I've
Yeah.
looked at Daniel very much.
Yeah.
And then sort of how later like New Testament comes back and builds on Daniel. So
Right.
that's a big point of the Story of God series.
It is, but also listen or being aware of ancient Near Eastern documents, not that Daniel would have known necessarily, but that somehow are part of the cultural milieu that he's operating in.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
and the exegetical ZECOT for short, this one, that's the
Mhm.
really long title. We'll just call it ZECOT because that's a lot easier. It does have a section on the canonical and theological significance of each chapter,
Mhm.
but it's not as much concerned with setting it in its ancient Near Eastern context and that sort of thing.
I noticed the emphasis on discourse analysis, and I remember looking. I think I had was it Grant Osborne did the one on Matthew, I think, in that series, and I loaned it to a student that never came back.
Oh,
But I remember being never loan your books to students. Just kidding. And I remember noticing the layout of the text
mhm.
with indentations and stuff, and I love doing that with Greek. I've never really tried it much with Hebrew, but throughout this book, for those of you who don't know, there are these. I don't know if the camera will pick this up, but these layouts of the text line by line with some indentations and comments on how it all fits together, and what does what, and how the various clauses and phrases get the point across. And of course, that's what those of us who aren't totally into the PhD university level use of discourse analysis. That's what the rest of us get out of it. It's trying to show how the individual bits of a passage make meaning in light of the whole passage. And I love to do that with the New Testament. I think it's great fun. Almost as much fun as tracing the Old Testament background for the New Testament. But those are like two of my favorite things. So basically, it's a deeper dive into the language and the syntax, the phraseology, how each chunk becomes a chunk, and how the little chunks that make up the big chunk chunkify themselves into the big picture.
Yes. I have used your word chunkify, by the way, and it's fun. Not in the book.
I,
It's not in the book.
I think I have a trademark on that. So
Do you? Okay. Well, I don't
you'll,
know if I gave you credit for it because I probably couldn't remember where I heard it.
yeah,
Sorry.
you'll be hearing from my
Your
attorney.
lawyer? Okay, your people.
So what was, to you personally, uh, I know when you write a book, you pay a price because your life changes when you are dedicated to writing a book. So tell us a little bit about this last one. What was the process? How long did it take? Uh, did you stay up into the wee hours, or did you like get up at 4 in the morning, or how
No,
did
I
that
don't do
go?
that sort of thing. I can't stay up into the wee. If I had stayed up into the wee hours, you probably wouldn't want to read it. Let's just put it there.
You're not a
I think
night.
no, definitely not a night owl. I'd get up at 4 a.m. before I'd stay up into the wee hours. I think the hardest part about, well, several things are hard about it. First of all, writing a second commentary on the same book is a little tricky.
Mhm.
Um, Settling on what sort of methodology I would use to analyze, that was a little hard. But I think the hardest thing was that I started it in 2015, just after I had made an interstate or across the country move and into a life I didn't really know what it was going to look like. And my job was insecure and just this really tumultuous period of life. I started it then and I finished it in 2019. So over 6 years. So there were just a lot of stops and starts. And it's really hard, as you know, to to do a project like that, a writing project, when you can't get and keep the momentum to do it. So every time you start over, you feel like you're starting over. So that was hard. It was also, what was also difficult is that I submitted my manuscript just before COVID hit. And so it really got stuck in editorial hell. A deep, dark pipeline of projects. And it's not the publisher's fault. It was the way the world was. So I didn't get my edits back until like 3 years later, which is
Wow.
then I have to, start all over again in my head.
Yeah.
It just was painful and slow, and yeah, that was difficult.
Sounds like your manuscript was sort of sent into exile like Daniel was.
It kind of was, yeah. Yes.
I see. Yeah.
But it came back. It returned.
Yeah. Well, that's the idea, right? You're gonna what's that? Sleep in the dust of the earth for a while, and then you're going to be resurrected to see the glory that's coming.
Yep.
We're really going into metaphors now, aren't we?
Yeah, right.
So since you've done two and you've tried to legitimately distinguish the one from the other in terms of the writing, so that a person is getting something different in the second one that they didn't get in the first.
Mm-hmm.
I know a little bit about that because I did the two different Matthew commentaries, the first for the Cornerstone series and the second for the Baker series. And I'll not be as rigorous as you. I literally cut and pasted the Cornerstone series, what I'd said there, into the manuscript that I started with for the Baker.
Yeah, I did a lot of that, and then I would highlight it, or I would write, select a different color font, so it would be like a dark blue.
Yeah.
And then I knew if it was still dark blue, I'd have to change. I would have to reword that or so. So yes, I definitely did that.
Yeah. So I went through conscientiously, and I don't think anyone who wants to check this out, but if you do get a life, it's not worth it. But I don't think any two sentences in there are the same, but I did write the one based on the other, of course, adding a lot of things more appropriate to the exegetical side of the series, and all those horrible footnotes, and make sure you didn't forget anybody that's ever written anything remotely connected to what you're trying to say.
Yeah. No, for sure. That's what I did. I definitely used the first one as a base manuscript, and then reshaped and moved things around, and obviously added and had to restructure because the format's different, and reword and all of that. And a lot of the, some of the things that are in Story of God actually became footnotes in ZECOT, because they weren't so much interested in the ancient Near Eastern background of a particular passage. So I would footnote that because I know my reader cares, but it's not part of the flow of the argument. So some of the material was rewritten into footnotes.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you look back now, having written twice, what would you say would be the toughest part of Daniel to expound? I mean,
well, I think that for me, the toughest part to write is probably also the toughest part to preach. So I'm guessing most people listening to this will know what that is. First, we're going to be in the second half of Daniel. Daniel 9 is really hard, and Daniel 10 through 12 are really hard. Daniel 10 through 12 because there's so much, and you can't go into the detail, and you shouldn't go into the detail with your congregation because the details aren't necessarily that relevant. But trying to sift through that and into something that is intelligible and meaningful and faithful to what I believe to be faithful to the text, that was hard. That was hard.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe chapter 11. I remember way back before it wasn't that I didn't know anything, I didn't even suspect anything, but I had been given the opportunity to teach a class back in the day at Grace Seminary, which was like a traditional class there they had had for years. and it was a 4-hour class. You got 2 hours in the fall, 2 hours in the spring. It was Daniel and Revelation. So I remember having to teach that. And for the first time, just having to do more than what I had heard at Bible prophecy conferences about Daniel,
Mhm.
and becoming uneasy about the, I guess, I call it dispensationalism.
I
The,
saw that typo. Yeah, I thought, is
yeah,
that a typo? No, I don't think that's a typo.
oh,
I
it's
think
not a type. It's not a word, but I use it anyway.
it should be a
And,
word.
just beginning to realize, hey, there's a lot going on here that they didn't tell me about.
Yeah.
And in order to be honest with the text, I need to do more with it than just go over the discussion of the 70 weeks that argues about when you start calculating which decree of Cyrus you start with, and whether you use 360-day years or 365, and how you account for leap years, and whether it all comes out on the triumphal entry into Jerusalem or on Good Friday.
Yeah.
I think Dr. Wood had it come out at the baptism, if I'm not mistaken. But
Yeah.
anyway, just the preoccupation with the details without paying any attention to the historical setting of the book, what it meant to the people of God at that time,
Mhm.
and trying to come up with a message that it brings to the people of God today,
Yeah.
other than just speculation.
Yeah.
And,
Well, the thing about Daniel 9, I mean, you're talking specifically about those last 4 verses, the 70 weeks, uh, famously called the dismal swamp of Old Testament scholarship. And it is, it's a dismal swamp. It is grim. But the thing about it, at least in terms of the ZECOT commentary, so I'm concerned about the emphasis of the author and the flow of the argument and all of that, how they shaped the text. And most of Daniel 9 is not that. It's this wonderful penitential prayer.
yeah.
And so if you're really going to get at what Daniel 9 is about, if you leave that out, you've missed it, because it's, 20 verses of the chapter. And then you've got these 4 verses at the end that are full of symbolism, and they're also full of textual difficulties and all sorts of places one might argue about what it actually is and how we might read it. So honestly, in the second commentary, a lot of the perspective on those 70 weeks is footnoted, the arguments, because it's not, there's 20 other verses here. And if you want to talk about the argument, you have to stick with that. And how does that affect how you read it? But
I recall just the tedium of that, and the huge ideas that this is how God is finally going to deal with sin permanently. That's what I would recall being the gist of those 6 infinitives there. But instead of focusing on that and rejoicing in that and exalting in that, so much preaching and teaching that I heard back in the day was trying to dig out the chronology and come up with some sort of a spectacular fulfillment to the day.
Yeah. And I think to put an end to sin, yes, and all the 6 infinitives, this glorious picture that's painted, the purpose of the 70 weeks. But if you come away from Gabriel's 4-verse prophecy without some sense of how that atonement for sin and how that wonderful redemption is going to occur, then you've missed it. And I think in my reading of it, the 70 weeks, there's a whole lot of symbolism. There's Leviticus 25 and 26 in the sabbatical year, and the 7-fold punishment, and a 10-fold redemption, and the idea of Jubilee. And it all takes you not point by point by point, but in this amazing Old Testament picture, it takes you to Jesus being the Jubilee. This this tenfold completion of all God's been doing. So I think that's how you get to Jesus better than focusing on who's the first anointed one, who's the second anointed one, because then you've missed this amazing jubilee.
Yeah.
But it's hard to preach because I've tried, I've done it, but it's really hard because you can't just step from the 70 weeks text to Jesus being the jubilee. There's a whole lot of background, and to
Yeah.
try to take a congregation through that is really thorny and overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just the the Old Testament background that you've alluded to, and then the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 24 and parallels, 2 Thessalonians 2, I think Paul has got that on his mind. And of course, the book of Revelation. And we're not going to work all that out today. But it's intellectually challenging, to be sure.
Yeah.
And none of us, I think, certainly I wouldn't, not being a Daniel scholar, but I would think anyone that has a right mind about it, standing before God, would not want to say, I've mastered everything that is here, and now I know exactly how all this fits together.
No. And I use you in a footnote, actually, from your Matthew commentary on Daniel, or on Matthew 24, where the abomination of desolation, and Jesus refers to that. And so how is what he's referring to a fulfillment, and was there a fulfillment with Antiochus Epiphanes, and are there future fulfillments? And I would say yes to all of that. Daniel, if the book does nothing else, and it certainly does do more, it sets up patterns and prototypes for how we understand the unfolding of history. So at the heart of the book, so you've got the Aramaic chiasm, chapters 2 through 7. And at the heart of that chiasm are chapters 4 and 5, the stories of Nebuchadnezzar's humbling and Belshazzar's humbling. So you've got these two Gentile kings who, I think in the larger story of the book, form their prototypes for Gentile kings. And Nebuchadnezzar, by the time he exits the stage in the book of Daniel, he is the prototype for what a Gentile king ought to be. He's acknowledged the sovereignty of God over his ruling kingdom. And that's how he leaves. That's his last word, glorifying the God of Israel. And then you have Belshazzar, who didn't learn from the example of his father, his predecessor. And he becomes the prototype for, Ernst Lucas calls Belshazzar a pale foreshadowing of the kings to come in the book. And he becomes this prototype for what the evil kings will be. So when you get to chapter 7 in Daniel's first vision, and Daniel 8, Daniel's second vision, those visions occur during the reign of Belshazzar.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's an accidental note. That's not an insignificant point.
Yeah.
Belshazzar sets the pattern that gets picked up by those kings, by Antiochus Epiphanes, and on through history until you get to the man of lawlessness. And so at the heart of Daniel, you have these two Gentile kings. I mean, it's magnificent. And yet God is sovereign over all of them. And God's kingdom alone is going to endure. Even the great Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom did not endure.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I first began to have my eyes open to these things, I was just amazed at how Daniel, rubbed Belshazzar's nose, I guess, in it, so to speak, with Nebuchadnezzar. You knew all these things that happened to your predecessor, and yet you continued to flaunt yourself over the God of Israel. And you're having this big party and using the temple vessels to get drunk with. And so the handwriting is on the wall. So to transition here, we've sort of been spilling over into the area of preaching and teaching, which we ought to, because we're not studying Daniel just because we're curious about an ancient book. We believe it's relevant today, and we're called to help people get it and communicate it. But you just did a series of lectures at Denver Seminary, what we call this, the Shannon lectureship there about a month ago, I guess, a little bit more than a month now, on Daniel and preaching and the theology of Daniel and how it should be expounded. And so maybe if you can just draw on that and give us a nutshell version of what you think about preaching Daniel, what its message is for today. You know, first of all, I guess, what is its message to us individually? And then how do you communicate that to other people? But I was noticing happily when I was glancing at the book, and I acknowledge that I received a free copy of the book from Zondervan. I appreciate it, and I'm not under any obligation to just say how wonderful the book is for that. So I'll say what I think about the book one way or the other. But I noticed how you are acknowledging the Aramaic section from chapters 2 to 7 as integral to the structure of the book, and thereby integral to the message of the book. And I recall back when I was a student of Daniel a long time ago, when I was tasked with teaching it for the first time and realized I had no clue. I did a lot of scrambling around and reading, and I found very few people who paid much attention to that elephant on the sofa. That why is this big chunk of the book in Aramaic? And there's a little key to that there. What is it? Chapter 2, verse 4. He said in Aramaic. And at the end, it doesn't have that outro, does it? It just switches.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking not many people were saying much about that. Of course, I may not have been reading the right people.
Yeah.
But I remember there was one fellow, Robert Culver, who was not known to be an Old Testament scholar, but was sort of a generalist. And his understanding was that the Aramaic sections were there because Aramaic, being the wider language of the ancient Eastern world, the message that was more widely appropriate for the wider ancient Near Eastern context and Israel's role with the Gentile nations was put in Aramaic. But when the text turned back to Israel itself and the implications of this current situation of exile and the future restoration, it went back to Hebrew when the focus was back on Israel. I'm not sure that totally plays out or that's a totally valid approach. So to start off, I guess, with the preaching side, how would you connect that Aramaic chunk in the book to its message and to how to communicate it today?
Yeah, well, it's clearly intentional. The Aramaic is clearly intentional. The intention isn't clear, but it's clearly intentional. And I say it's clearly intentional because the 6 chapters that are Aramaic do form this chiastic structure where you have parallel stories. And I don't know any commentator who disagrees with that. So chapter 2 and chapter 7 are both visions of 4 earthly kingdoms, followed by the 5th eternal kingdom of God. Chapter 3 and chapter 5 are the fiery furnace and Daniel and the lion's den. So you've got faithful Jews who are suffering for their commitment. And then chapters 4 and 5 are, I can't do numbers, but the middle ones, 4 and 5 are, Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. So it's clearly an organized, intentional thing. And there are plenty of views on what the intention is. So you sort of have to figure out what you think it is. And I do agree that it is the language of the day. But it's also the language of exile. Aramaic was the language of exile. And these 6 chapters really do focus on that life in exile. And so I think that part of the purpose of these Aramaic chapters, this structure, are the themes that it puts forth. And at the heart of the chiasm is this theme of Gentile kings and their relationship to the God of Israel. And that he is sovereign. He is in control. He bestows power and he takes it away. And you've got, on either side of that, you've got faithful Jews trying to live in response to their Gentile governments, if you will. And Gentile governments or kings come in different shapes and sizes. Some of them are hostile to the gospel, like Nebuchadnezzar was in chapter 3, at least. Some of them are not. Darius liked Daniel, and he wasn't necessarily opposed to what Daniel wanted to practice in his faith. So you've got different kinds of Gentile kingdoms in which we live, and there are different ways to be faithful.
Mhm.
And then the outside chapters 2 and 7 give us this cosmic view, this much wider view of history and of God's role in it. So I think, and at the heart of it is the Gentile kings. But then you've got chapter 7, which is this weird animal in the whole structure of the book, because it's Aramaic, so it's connected to 2 through 7, but it's also an apocalyptic vision, which connects it to the rest of the book. So you cannot just divide the book in half. People do, but you shouldn't, so don't.
Mhm.
Because you're losing something. Chapter 7 holds the book together. It won't let you divide. In terms of language and genre, it's the hinge.
Yeah.
But it's also, in a lot of ways, the heart of the book, because it's got this magnificent view of the divine throne room and the one like a son of man who receives the kingdom.
Yeah.
And then you've got the suffering of the saints of the Holy One, and you've got this view of world history. It's just this amazing, glorious vision that is actually the last view of the kingdom of God you get in the book. And then in chapter 8, you turn to this really grim future for the Jews back in the land, and these prophecies of what's to come. And in the context of Daniel, these are happening, these visions to Daniel are coming while the people are in exile. So in some ways, they might think the worst has already happened. We've lost the land, we've lost the temple, we've lost our king. It can't get any worse than this. And Daniel has these visions that say, oh, wait, there's going to be an even greater exile, which is Daniel 9. And it's going to get even worse for a long time to come. And so you've got to hang on to this vision of chapter 7.
Lost your audio.
Uh-oh. Still? Am I gone?
Can't hear you, sorry.
I don't know why.
Now you're back.
Okay, where'd you lose me?
Well, you were explaining how the Jews were looking for an end from exile, and the answer to that is there's even a longer exile ahead.
A longer exile, and things are going to get worse, and the kings are going to get worse, and the suffering's going to get worse. But at the end of all that, Daniel 12 ends with this resurrection. So I forgot where I was going with this, but I think you have to preach, or at least help your congregation see this chiasm, these 6 chapters that set forth this life in exile. And what are the great promises, and what's the view of God we get in this exile? And then how are we to be faithful in it? And we get examples of that.
Mhm.
So you want to do that without, overemphasizing chiasm and all the other things that are just going to go beyond your congregation.
Yeah. Well, you start with Daniel in exile, and then you have this Aramaic chunk that basically shows what the exile is really going to be: 2 and 7, 3 and 6, 4 and 5, and then I guess the rest of the book sort of lays that out, what that means for the future.
Mhm.
So in terms of the message to us personally, to our in many of our cases, prosperous suburban churches, folks making lots of money, even though they complain about the economy all the time. Not only that, but folks in the inner city who are struggling to make it. How does Daniel connect up to say both of those audience? Speaking very hyper generalized here, but how do we contextualize it?
Yeah. Well, I think the message of Daniel, really broadly speaking, is twofold. And the first is to take heart, because no matter what the world looks like, no matter where you live, no matter who your leaders are, no matter what your personal circumstances are, God's on the throne, and his throne is higher than any other throne. So, Daniel, he begins as he's always a captive, he's in exile, but yet he also rises in power to become very, very powerful in the land. So Daniel sort of lives in both of those places that you were talking about. He's the captive, but he also reaches a place, you might say, of great affluence. But take heart, no matter what life is like, God's on the throne. And the second part, I think, is to stand firm, because you know what God is like, what your God is like, and what he can do. no matter what life looks like, you can stand firm. You can be faithful to God. If your overlords are hostile, if they are not, if they're benign, if they don't really care, you can stand firm to the God, to who you know God to be, because of who he is, because his throne is higher, because his kingdom is the only one that's eternal. So I would say take heart and stand firm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just thinking about Daniel's exile and Israel's exile sort of personified by him there, being a picture of the church's pilgrimage in the world. Not that the church has the national promises, the theonomy, whatever you want to call it, of the Old Testament, but you think of texts in the New Testament, like in the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 24, they that endure to the end shall be saved. And you think about the way in which the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse, points out the reality of martyrdom and persecution and all kinds of other things, but all of that will eventuate, like in Daniel 12, they that sleep in the dust of the ground will be raised. So you come to Revelation 20, and you have the same scene of resurrection and future blessing. So I think the eschatology doesn't function in the Bible, and this is obviously not a new insight, but one that some of us may have come to later than we should have because we're dumb, speaking of myself particularly, that eschatology isn't there in the Bible as something to incite us to curiosity and speculation. It's there to give us hope during tough times and to keep us true to the faith.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I can't say it better than that.
Well, I doubt that. I'm sure you could, but it's my website, so you're probably trying not to be. No, I'd love to hear you talk more about it, but I think we're probably going on. I don't know, 45 minutes or so already. So I think we've already violated the whole podcast rules of making it short because people don't have an attention span anymore. So hopefully those who have labored with us through this video have learned something and have enjoyed it, and they've endured to the end, and hopefully in that sense they will be saved. So thanks so much. It's always good to talk. We should talk more often, speaking for myself. And God bless your ministry. And I hope both of these books will get a wide hearing. I think they have a message that will strengthen the church for the days ahead.
I think they do. So,
all right.
Thanks.
So now if I can find my stop recording button, there it is. Thanks so much, Wendy.
Yep, you're welcome.
Bye.